Hi everyone. So here's your cardiovascular anatomy overview. Again, structure is function, and to truly understand how things work in the body, we definitely need an understanding of how they're structurally built and interact with one another. So we'll start with a schematic of the whole cardiovascular system. And now, obviously, this isn't what it truly looks like in our bodies. It's much more um, involved and ingrained and intertwined throughout an entire body, which makes sense based off of what you've learned so far in class, which is our cells need ATP to survive and have energy and be able to work. So, in order to do that, one of the main things we need is oxygen delivered to every part of our body. And so, sure enough, here we'll take a look at this schematic, and we can see that right here in the center is our heart, and that pumps blood around our circulatory system or our vascular system. And, classically illustrated here, we have the blue side of our cardiovascular system, which is the deoxygenated blood, and the red side here, that is our oxygenated blood. And we can see that as blood goes out to the body, and the periphery, meaning our extremities and the rest of our body, it gets to these little bridge points, I guess you could call them, where they go through capillaries and then return back to the heart. So this is our general understanding probably that most of us have to start with, but let's give it a little bit more detailed and better terminology, right? A little bit more specific and a little bit more scientific. So we actually have two circulatory or circuits of blood in our body. So the first one that we'll talk about is our pulmonary system, and that essentially includes the blood circuit that goes to our lungs. So if we start here in the heart, where there's blood without, and we'll talk about this a bit more detail a bit later on. So we have blood without or deoxygenated blood in our heart, and it gets pumped to our lungs. Our lungs then allow oxygen to transfer to the red blood cells or hemoglobin in our blood, and then back to the heart. So that one circuit is our pulmonary circuit. Okay, so it's just the one. Then once it's in the heart, it goes out to our periphery, okay, or our peripheral circulation, or peripheral cardiovascular circuit, and that's this part that gets put out all over our body. So it doesn't go to the heart, it goes all over our body here. Okay, and the order at which it goes is it starts at larger veins, larger vascular structures called arteries. Okay, so they're quite large, they're quite muscular, and they need to in order to handle the pressure with the blood that goes out. Some of you would have covered this in lab already, right? Where our systolic, or the blood pressure going out of the heart, is quite high. On average, 120 millimeters of mercury, right? So we get all this pressure that pushes all this blood out into our arteries. And then as we kind of start approaching, let's approach some organs here. So no, there's too much. Okay, let's start approaching the arm. So we went out of the heart, oxygenated. Okay, we're in arteries. Now as we're getting closer to, say, organs or different body parts, we're going to have a narrowing of the vasculature. So we go from arteries to arterioles. So it's a little bit more narrow, a little less muscular in and around this structure, until the point that we get all the way down to the actual, let's say, limb or organ. And what will happen is we get to this structure called a capillary, or capillary bed. Okay, so these capillaries are just very thin. They're about 1 cell thick, and what they do is they allow really good gas exchange, right? So oxygen can leave the blood, and we can pull carbon dioxide and other waste products into the blood to get circulated away from the organ or limbs, okay, or working muscles, right? So that's when we get to the other side of the capillaries, and then we get to something called venules. So arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and then we get into larger veins. Little important note here about the venous side or the vein side of our circulatory system is, unlike the arterial side where there's very thick muscular walls, our veins are actually kind of flimsy in comparison, I guess you could say, but they're not as thick, and the main reason is we don't have the same amount of pressure on our vascular system at that point in time. Okay, so again, we get venous blood returning to the heart, ready to go through our pulmonary circulatory system before it goes on to our peripheral circulatory system, and rinse and repeat. Okay, good. That's a good starting overview. Yeah, we covered all of this. Again, venous blood is blood in the veins. Arterial blood is blood in the arteries. And just a quick note about that and a reminder, I already spoke about it, but the blood leaving your heart to go to your lungs is considered the pulmonary arteries. So even though it's one of the few times that an artery will have deoxygenated blood in it, okay? That's a little unique kind of situation relative to the rest of the circulatory system. Okay, great. So let's take a closer look now at how blood actually travels through the heart. Okay, and we also have a lot of heart structures that we need to get familiar with. Okay, so we'll start with the anatomy and then we'll move on to the actual blood flow, although you can see the arrows here in the diagram anyway, but I digress. We'll do anatomy first. So this is a transection or a cross section of the heart, and what you might notice is just generally the shape at first. So we kind of have this section over here and this half over here, and if we got rid of all these let's say vascular structures, we can kind of see where the more common heart shape that we use for emoji, just everything, right, that we draw, etc. It's kind of the shape of a heart, right? It's a little stylized, but I digress. But what's actually in it? So let's take a look. So what we have is 4 chambers of the heart. There are some mammals that have 2 chambers, and I think fish even have, some might have 1, but definitely 2 or 4 chambered heart are the more common structures. We have 4. So we'll start here in this area called the atrium. And we have 2 atria and 2 ventricles, one of each on the left and the right side respectively. So let's cover that again. So here's our right atria. When you're looking at a picture of the heart, if this is your right side, it'll be opposite. So you kind of picture if someone had their heart facing you, just remember that it's opposite to what yours is, right? It's that mirror image. Okay, so we have our right atrium here. What happens then is we get into our left ventricle, or blood flows that way, and it does through something called a tricuspid valve. We have 2 semilunar valves and 2 atrial ventricular valves. So atrium, ventricular. So atria, ventricle, atrial ventricular valve goes in the middle, okay? It describes what it is for you, okay? So the tricuspid is an AV valve. So it goes, so blood will again start here, flow through into the ventricle. As the heart contracts, it gets pushed out through the semilunar valve. So the right is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. Why? Where is blood going? Well, it's not just a clever name, it is very descriptive. It's going to the pulmonary circular system. If you remember from what we just covered, that means it's going to the lungs. So we have our pulmonary arteries pushing deoxygenated blood towards the lungs to become oxygenated. Remember, this is the only artery that you'll see that has deoxygenated blood in it typically, okay? It goes left to right. Lungs comes back into the heart here through the pulmonary veins. Again, this is switched from what's typical. So we have oxygenated blood coming in through the left and the right pulmonary veins into the left atria. Okay, so again, there's the right atria where blood enters the heart, coming from the body, and then in the left atrium, blood comes into the heart from the lungs. Okay, so it's coming from the pulmonary side. Then we get into the left ventricle after it passes the bicuspid valve on the left side of the heart. And you'll notice, you might have already noticed here that the ventricles are much, much larger than the atria. And the reason for that is that's where we want to have the most blood in our heart before we contract outside of the heart. So we gather lots of blood. And sure enough, on this left side, where we'll tend to see more musculature, heart muscle, pumps out through, it's kind of tucked behind here. You can see it a little bit right where my laser pointer cursor is, the aortic semilunar valve. So not an AV valve, but a semilunar valve, and goes up, out into the arteries and into the peripheral circulatory system. So periphery, again, is just like your extremities, your organs, the rest of your body, other than your heart, other than your lungs. Okay? Now we're kind of, how do we get back to the start? Well, once blood gets collected in your veins after going through the capillaries or capillary beds, it gets back up into your heart. It comes back into your heart through two different veins. One is the superior vena cava, and you can just remember superior means up or higher up. So superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, inferior being below or lesser or lower, right? And then again, we're back to the right atrium, right? Okay, that was a bit of a run through. Know that. That's good. So if you are able to, on a whiteboard or a piece of paper on your own, go through from the start. I started in the atria, but you should probably start from the superior and inferior vena cava. Name all the structures that blood passes in the order it passes as it goes into the heart, through the heart, out to the pulmonary, back into the heart, and then out to your peripheral circulatory system. Okay. Good. Yes, we covered all of this except for the pericardium, and the reason being is it's not really depicted too well on the other illustration, but the pericardium is just like a tough, hard connective tissue that covers or encases the heart. Okay, so it's like a fluid-filled protection for your heart, right? I always thought of it as a water balloon that had enough stretch and give. And if my fist was the heart, that I could push down into the middle of this water balloon, and it's just surrounded and protected. And I think when you think of it that way, it makes sense why we might have one of those. So it allows the heart to expand and contract without pushing or having other organs push around it. It has that space to be able to move freely, but also be protected. So again, if you can imagine your fist in the middle of a water balloon, you could actually probably open and shut it, move it around pretty easily, and there's lots of range of mobility, and it's protected. Okay. Here's a nice written out version for blood flow through the heart. So if you are maybe less visual and more list-like, you could probably follow through this. That'd give you a good flow through. And originally I was planning in the lecture to run you through the flow of the blood here, but I think it actually made sense to do it as we're covering the anatomy. So we've kind of covered that as well now. Okay. Now, one thing that we haven't chatted about as far as blood flow and as far as structures of the heart is blood supply for the heart itself, right? We spoke about lungs and we spoke about the periphery, but the heart, the machine that's actually will beat from the moment you're alive to the moment you're not, is here. So it needs blood, right? It's a muscle. So that's maybe one thing I didn't fully specify is your heart has cardiac muscle. Okay, it's cardiac musculature. So it's slightly different than what skeletal muscle is. So they have these special, what's called intercaliculated discs, And what they are is essentially, with the cardiac muscle fibers, they're these little permeable, semi-permeable cell membranes. So essentially, you can think of it as, if you ever make, if you have fruit fly problems at home and you have that bowl of like vinegar and you put the cellophane or a plastic wrap over the top and you punch a little holes in it, and so there's little holes there and it allows air to exchange. With any luck, the fruit flies fly in and can't get out. It's kind of like that. So the in between the muscle fiber cells of cardiac cells, they meet and they have these little leaky holes that allow fluids to kind of exchange between the two cells. And one of the reasons that's really helpful is it helps the contraction of the heart be a bit more unified. Okay, so short version, we come back to that point a bit later. But yeah, so blood supply of the heart. How does the heart get oxygenated blood and have metabolic byproducts and deoxygenated blood leave it? Well, it has its own set of vasculature. Primarily, what's of concern, or what we're going to focus on, is coronary arteries. Okay, I'll show you an image in just a moment. So we have these coronary arteries that come off the aorta and wrap back onto the heart itself. And essentially, it gives the heart oxygenated blood and nutrients that it needs to be able to continue pumping and keeping you alive. Okay. What's an important concept? I think in biology it comes up a few times, but in particular with the heart here, we have certain redundancy systems built in. One of them for us is the blood flow that serves the heart, right? In a worst case scenario, if you had blood flow blocked or severed with the main, let's say, artery leading to your arm or your hand or something like that, you could, in theory, lose a hand and still be able to live. If your heart doesn't get enough fresh blood supply to it, you end up dying or having a heart attack. So why is redundancy important? Well, it allows for some of the time when blockages occur for most other components of the heart to be able to continue getting blood. Okay, so that's a main point behind this term, or this idea of anastomosis. And all it is this intercommunication between two arteries that serve the same area. So if one gets blocked, blood flow can still get to the areas of concern here. Okay, so all major arteries and veins of the heart are on the outer surface. And if you think back to what I was mentioning about the pericardial sac, or that water balloon that the heart sits in, it makes sense. You know, we don't want these arteries and or veins getting blocked off while the heart's contracting, right? So while the heart's beating, we don't want the heart muscles itself to occlude or block off any of these blood vessels that serve the heart itself, right? It would kind of defeat the purpose, especially if we're exercising really hard and have a higher heart rate, right? Okay, so let's take a little look at what these look like. Now there's quite a few, as you can see. Superior vena cava should sound familiar now. Aorta should sound very familiar. It's the very strong artery coming out of the heart where blood goes to your periphery. But as far as coronary arteries, there's just a few in particular that I want you to take note of. Is the right coronary artery and the great cardiac vein. Okay, so that's on the two sides of the heart here. And this is the anterior view, I should specify. So that's the front side of the heart. It's obviously these vessels are important, but one of the most important, debatably, arteries or coronary blood vessels that we're dealing with here would be on the posterior, or the back side of the heart. So you can see we have our right coronary artery and our coronary sinus. So the artery brings oxygenated blood in. The coronary sinus that turns into the great cardiac vein are veins. So it pulls deoxygenated blood away from the heart. Okay. Yeah, and I guess also just of note, this is what a fully encapsulated heart would look like from the exterior. So not a transection, but the exterior. So a bit more superficial relative to the deep perspective that we had before. And this is what the backside of the heart looks like. Okay. Now, we spoke a lot about blood, and we all intuitively have an idea what it is and what it does, but it needs more time for discussion. It is pretty important, especially when we're talking about sport, and in particular endurance sports. Blood and oxygen delivery becomes very, very important. So what is blood? What does it do? We kind of mentioned it already, but it delivers essential substances. So we spoke about it as far as oxygen, but it also delivers nutrients. And if you recall our chat about metabolic substrates, we were talking about carbohydrates and sugars and blood sugar in particular, or blood glucose, and that's obviously carried through our blood, and it delivers it to our tissues. So when I say tissues, I mean like skeletal muscle, organs, anything that any of our living bodily tissues or. The other thing it does, and I mentioned this a few times, but just to give it in the right context in relation to our discussion on blood, it removes metabolic byproducts. So again, we spoke a lot about so far in this lecture carbon dioxide, but in previous sections we were speaking about lactate, right? And blood lactating, getting lactate from cells to the liver to go through the Cori cycle to come back as a new glucose for use to tissue. So again, that's a major component or function of blood. Okay. Now, what's in blood and what allows us to do all these really great things, super important for life, right? It's the transportation highway for us and our living cells, really. Well, red blood cells, right? That's typically when most of us, I think about blood. It's one of the things we think about first. And so red blood cells are comprised of hemoglobin. I got an extra photo or picture here. So it's made out of heme and globulin or globin, right? Let me pop back here. So the globin or globin is the protein, and the heme or the hemo part is the iron pigment or iron component of red blood cells. So if we look at a red blood cell, we can actually see there's 4 protein groups, so 2 beta, 2 alpha, and in each one of these we have this little heme group. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4 per red blood cell, and right in the middle of all of this is an ion actually. So when we have our nutrition, and if we're lacking in iron, they'll play a significant role in how our red blood cells and therefore how our blood works. Okay. So in adults, we produce that primarily in the long bones, in our bone marrow. And if you can picture like a classic cartoon bone that like a dog might be chewing on, that's a long bone. And in the middle of that, we have the spongy section, and then it's typically when we see it outside of people's or animals' bodies, like again, if a dog was chewing on a femur or something from a cow that you get at the butcher or whatever, in the middle it looks hollow, but typically there's marrow in there, bone marrow. And so in that bone marrow, that's where we make our red blood cells. Once they're made, the nuclei is removed, and one of the points of that is to make it smaller and have less surface area and less stuff inside, so that these red blood cells can get transported around our body a lot easier. In particular, squish through those cell thick, kind of 3-cell, maybe 2-cell around type areas of capillaries, right? So the thing is, they can't repair themselves, and it says a lifespan of 4 months, but you can actually get a turnover much quicker than 4 months. Well, I shouldn't say much, but about 52 days is generally also considered a turnaround time. And that's one of the reasons why when you go to donate blood, which I highly suggest you do, if you can, if you're not sure, go to Blood Services Canada, donate, feel good about yourself for saving 3 other people's lives. If you if you donate, you have to wait every 52 days or so, right? And you can do that fairly regularly. But the reason is the destruction of red blood cells and the production is typically very well balanced in us. One caveat, well, I shouldn't say a caveat to that, but one thing that comes up sometimes for endurance-based athletes is, runners in particular, is because they constantly are hitting the ground with their feet, we have blood flowing through our feet, right? So what happens is that physical impact can actually break up red blood cells a little more readily than, say, some other sports like swimming or running. And while it's not typically a problem because, again, most red blood cells are produced in a balanced manner, there's a good feedback system in order to have that. It's just something athletes that do a lot of running need to be aware of. So just making sure you're getting enough nutrients in recovery days typically is sufficient. Okay, so red blood cells, that's one component of blood. Another component is the plasma, so the fluid part of blood. Now, normally we might just think, oh, it's like red blood cells and water. Somewhat true, not quite. There's 90% of our plasma is water. There's 7% that are plasma proteins, and proteins can be made up of any number of things. We have like white blood cells and platelets and stuff in our blood, so that's there as well. And then 3% other. So there's different minerals and things like bicarbonate, which helps buffer our blood from carbon dioxide, and there's a few other things. But you are mostly correct when you say the main component of plasma is water. Okay. It's so of the fluid component, 90% is water, but of blood itself, it makes up about 50 to 60% of the total volume. So what that means is other components, such as white blood cells or red blood cells, they make up the rest of the percentage of that. Now these last few points I want to talk about now rather than saving it later for our exercise adaptations to exercise, or what our body adapts to when we exercise. But when we have our blood volume in our bodies, when we exercise, one of the ways we lose a lot of water or fluid from our blood and our body is through sweat, right? So we sweat quite a bit, and that can, depending on the temperature outside and the type of exercise and etc., how much we're cooled or duration, we can lose up to 10% of our blood plasma volume. Okay, and so that has repercussions as far as how our blood can move through our vascular system, right? If it's becoming less fluidic, it's becoming more what we call viscous. So it becomes more thick. And if you can imagine the difference of trying to pump, let's say, water through a pipe or pump oil through a pipe, the oil is said to be a lot more viscous, it's heavier, it's denser, and it doesn't like to flow as much, okay? So that's what can kind of start happening because we have this 50 to 60% of our total blood volume. All the solid parts of our blood start making our heart have to pump harder in order to keep blood moving, right? To get oxygen to our periphery. Now, this is one of the reasons why it's so important to drink water. And one of my undergrad research projects at UFE actually was looking at dehydration levels of Bikram yoga participants. And one of the things that I came across there was you can be classified clinically as dehydrated if you get to even 2% dehydration. Okay, so it's pretty minimal. So the fact that we can tolerate up to 10% for some types of physical activity and for some periods of time is pretty impressive. Okay. Now, with training and or with exposure to high temperatures, our bodies adapt to this. So we know we're going to be sweating a lot. We know that we can lose up to 10% of our body fluids, or our bodies understand this, or come to know this through our training. What will tend to happen is we'll hold more fluid. Okay, so our bodies are like, whoa, we're going to be losing 10% of our blood plasma volume. You know what? That's too taxing. It's too hard on the body. So it figures out a way to hold on more water within the blood. Okay, and this is just at rest. So it's like an adaptation that you get, if we're just resting. So this can happen again if you go somewhere really, really hot. It takes about 2 weeks to acclimatize and have this adaptation occur. 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the heat and your previous exercise training. So that's one of the reasons why, if you're a really good endurance trained athlete and you go somewhere that's really, really hot, you're actually better set up to adapt to that heat than, say, people who are untrained, because you have this extra blood volume around. It's kind of cool, eh? All right, and I already started speaking to this a little bit, but the formed elements in blood. So a large part of it is platelets. So platelets are important for clotting our blood if we get cut. They are quite large molecules. And they play a role in. So there's this pathogenesis, or this process that occurs that when our arteries start to harden. So you might have heard the term before, hardened arteries, or plaque on the inside of our blood vessels, or getting a heart attack because of a blockage. So all these things happen through this, it's like an inflammation, or it's an inflammation response that occurs on the inside of our blood vessels. And essentially more and more of these platelets kind of get in this feedback loop where they keep trying to repair a certain area within our blood vessels, typically because of some sclerotic, or they become sclerotic, which is hardened. And a couple of things can happen when those plaques get hard. Is parts of it can break off and then block smaller blood vessels farther down the line, which would cause what's called an emboli, or potentially a stroke if it's in the brain. Or it can just totally occlude that blood vessel, essentially, so red blood cells can't get through, and then you get a blockage in that particular part of your body, whether it's your heart or brain, or a different part of your body. So definitely something to know. Platelets are important for sure, both for staying alive, as well as hopefully it doesn't happen, but can cause harm as well to us. So so that's one of the main parts. So blood cells, white blood cells is another component, and again, we already spoke about red blood cells. So this part here, as I mentioned before, so blood is the liquid part, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are the solid components. And that concludes our discussion on our anatomy for our cardiovascular system.